There are moments in existence where power stops being a tool and becomes identity itself. Sung Jin-woo had crossed that threshold long ago. The Shadow Monarch no longer fought within him, it simply was him. His authority over death had grown so absolute that the boundary between living ruler and eternal sovereign had dissolved into something quieter than fear, deeper than dominance. He stood alone in a realm between dimensions, a place where light forgot how to exist and shadows breathed with the patience of gods. Millions of soldiers knelt in perfect silence behind him, not corpses animated by necromancy, but willing extensions of his will. They were not slaves, they were purpose-given form. Jinwoo had learned something few conquerors ever grasp: true power whispers. He closed his eyes and felt the infinite army respond, their loyalty not bound by magic or compulsion, but by recognition. They served the one who had walked through death and claimed dominion not through cruelty, but through inevitability. There were no enemies left to fight, no gates to conquer, only the endless quiet of a king who had transcended struggle itself. And yet, something stirred, a pulse. Faint, ancien. Older than the system that had granted him his abilities, older than the architects who designed the gates. It resonated not with his shadows, but with the concept of dominion itself, the idea that one being could rule over forces that defied natural law. Jinwoo's eyes opened. Violet light flickered in the darkness. Across an unimaginable distance, in a world where curses bled from human emotion and sorcerers bent reality through will alone, Gojo Satoru laughed. He stood suspended 300 meters above Tokyo, arms spread wide as space itself fractured around him like shattered glass. His opponent, a special-grade curse born from humanity's collective fear of isolation, had made the mistake of trying to trap him in a pocket dimension. The creature had poured centuries of accumulated power into collapsing the space around Gojo, compressing infinity itself into a singular point meant to erase him from existence. Gojo yawned. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice carrying through the distorted air with casual amusement. "You actually thought that would work." He raised one finger. The pocket dimension inverted. The curse screamed as its own technique consumed it, reality folding the creature into geometric impossibility, before erasing it so completely that even the memory of its existence began to fade. But something else happened. As Gojo pushed his limitless technique beyond its theoretical maximum, as he bent space into shapes that shouldn't exist and made infinity eat itself just to prove a point, he felt it, a presence. Not hostile, not even conscious in a way he could define. Just there, watching, resonating. His smile faded slightly. His 6 eyes, which could perceive the fundamental structure of cursed energy across miles, suddenly saw something they had never seen before. A thread of connection leading somewhere that wasn't Tokyo, wasn't Japan, wasn't even his universe. "Huh," Gojo muttered. "That's new." The ancient force nexus, dormant for eons in a region of space the Star Wars galaxy had forgotten, pulsed with sudden awareness. It had felt them both. One who commanded death without darkness, one who touched infinity without consequence. 2 impossibilities that defied the binary nature of the Force itself, neither light nor dark, neither Jedi nor Sith, but something orthogonal to destiny entirely. The Nexus didn't think. It didn't choose. It simply responded the way a vacuum responds to pressure, the way gravity responds to mass. It reached. Reality screamed. Jinwoo felt his shadow realm shatter like glass. The millions of soldiers flickered, their forms destabilizing as the fundamental laws holding his domain together began to rewrite themselves. He raised his hand, trying to reinforce his authority, but the pull was absolute, not stronger than him, but wrong. It bypassed strength entirely, targeting the concept of his existence rather than his power. Gojo's infinity collapsed inward. For the first time since perfecting his technique, something touched him. Not an attack. Not cursed energy. Just pure, incomprehensible force that ignored the mathematical reality of infinite space because it operated on different mathematics entirely. "Oh, this is bad," Gojo said, his tone still light but edged with genuine surprise. Both were torn from their worlds simultaneously. A corridor opened between dimensions, not hyperspace, not cursed energy, not shadow. Something older. Something that existed before universes learned how to separate themselves from each other. The walls of the corridor pulsed with colors that had no names, and the distance between Jinwoo and Gojo collapsed despite them being pulled from different realities entirely. For one impossible moment, they saw each other. Two figures suspended in the space between worlds, one surrounded by dissolving shadows and absolute calm, one wreathed in fracturing light and irreverent curiosity. Neither spoke. There was no time. The corridor convulsed, and reality shattered completely. When the Force Nexus finally released them, it was into a galaxy that had no prophecy, no ancient vision, no prepared destiny for what had just arrived. The Star Wars universe had just encountered its first gods who owed nothing to the Force. The Force is many things, an energy field that binds all living things. The will of the cosmos made tangible. A river of destiny that flows through every moment, every choice, every death and birth across trillions of lives. It touches everything. It knows everything. It is, in the most fundamental sense, the connective tissue of the Star Wars galaxy's reality. But now, for the first time in its eternal existence, the Force encountered something it could not touch. Sung Jin-woo materialized in the ruins of an abandoned temple on a forgotten moon. His arrival made no sound. There was no flash of light, no distortion of space. One moment the temple was empty, the next he was simply there, as if he had always existed in that spot, and reality was only just now noticing. He stood perfectly still, assessing. New world. New rules. The air tasted different, not just chemically, but spiritually. There was something alive in the space around him, a presence that pressed against everything like invisible water. The Force reached toward him, curious and instinctive, the way a body's immune system investigates foreign matter. It touched his shadows, and recoiled. Jinwoo felt the contact subtle, probing, almost gentle. The presence tried to understand him, to categorize him within its binary framework of light and dark. But his shadows didn't register as dark side corruption. They weren't fueled by hatred or fear or suffering. They simply were. Authority without emotion, dominion without desire. The Force tried to define them and found nothing to grasp. His shadows moved independently of the Force entirely, responding only to him. Somewhere in the temple ruins, a Jedi holocron activated spontaneously, its ancient programming triggered by the disturbance. The blue-tinged projection of a long-dead master flickered to life, opened its mouth to speak and immediately shut down. The Force had no guidance to offer. The prophecies contained no reference point. Jinwoo's expression remained unchanged. He had learned long ago that power was only impressive to those who lacked it. This new energy field, this Force, was vast and ancient and woven through everything around him. It was also irrelevant to his authority. Halfway across the galaxy, Gojo Satoru appeared 300 meters above an Imperial-occupied city. He hung suspended in the air, infinity automatically active, and looked down at the sprawling metropolis with genuine interest. Architecture he'd never seen. Technology that ran on principles his 6 eyes were already beginning to decode. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, that same weird energy field he'd felt in the corridor. The Force pressed against him immediately, drawn to the anomaly like white blood cells surrounding an infection. It tried to read his intentions, failed. It tried to sense his presence in the living Force, found nothing. It attempted to perceive his future, saw only recursive impossibility probability branches collapsing into each other because infinity made causality optional. Dark side tendrils, remnants of Sith rituals performed in the city centuries ago, rose from their dormant state and reached toward Gojo. They sensed power, assumed it could be corrupted, attempted to whisper promises of greater strength. They got within 3 meters of him and stopped. Not blocked, not repelled, simply stopped. The way someone walking toward a wall stops when they realize the wall extends infinitely in all directions. The dark side tendrils curled back on themselves, confused, unable to comprehend a space they could not enter. Gojo tilted his head, intrigued. "So this is the Force everyone's been going on about," he muttered to himself. His 6 eyes could perceive it now, a vast network of energy connecting every living thing in sight. Impressive, beautiful even. The complexity was remarkable, but it couldn't touch him. In the deepest sanctuaries of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, what remained of it after the Empire's rise, Force spirits stirred from meditation. Ancient masters who had become one with the Force, their consciousness dissolved into the cosmic whole, suddenly felt wrongness, not evil, not darkness, something orthogonal to their understanding. 2 points in the galaxy where the Force became observer rather than participant. On Korriban, in tombs where Sith lords had slumbered for millennia, whispers turned to screams. The ancient Darksiders, whose spirits had clung to existence through hatred and will, felt Sung Jin-woo's presence like a void that consumed voids. He was death that owned death, darkness that had nothing to do with emotion or philosophy, just pure, absolute authority over the concept of ending. Several Sith spirits tried to reach across space to investigate. Their consciousness touched his shadow realm and was immediately claimed. No struggle. No grand battle of wills. They simply became his, added to his army with the same casual totality as every other being he had ever decided to keep. The remaining Sith spirits went silent. In his throne room on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine paused mid-sentence during a strategic briefing. His yellow eyes narrowed. He had felt something too, something that made his precognitive abilities stutter. Futures he had carefully arranged suddenly became uncertain. Variables that hadn't existed moments ago now infected every probability chain. He reached deeper into the Force, trying to perceive the nature of the disturbance. The Force, for the first time in his long life, had no answer. Across the galaxy, Force-sensitive beings of every alignment felt the same creeping realization. The rules had changed. The prophecies were incomplete. The balance they had spent millennia trying to understand had just encountered forces that existed outside the equation entirely. Two men. One who commanded death without corruption. One who touched infinity without consequence. The Force looked into them both. And for the first time in galactic history, the Force blinked first. The Imperial garrison on Ryloth's northern continent had been established 3 years prior with one purpose: suppress the local resistance through overwhelming displays of brutality. The strategy was simple, efficient, and had been proven across 100 worlds. Execute civilians publicly. Broadcast the executions. Wait for hope to die. Today's execution was proceeding according to schedule. 15 Twi'lek civilians knelt in the plaza, hands bound, surrounded by stormtroopers. An officer droned through charges of sedition while citizens watched from behind barricades, their faces carefully neutral. Fear had become the planet's official religion. The officer raised his hand, signaling the execution squad. A shadow fell across the plaza. Not metaphorically. An actual shadow, darker than absence of light, spreading from the alley behind the execution platform like spilled ink. The stormtroopers noticed it first, their white armor suddenly cast in silhouette by darkness that had no visible source. Several turned, raising their blasters toward the alley. Sung Jin-woo stepped out of the shadow as if stepping through a curtain. He looked exactly like what he was. A young man in dark armor, handsome features unmarked by the cruelty that power usually carves into a face. His eyes swept across the plaza, the kneeling civilians, the executioners, the officer still frozen with his hand raised. Jinwoo's expression didn't change. No anger, no righteousness, just a quiet, terrible assessment. "Lower your weapons and leave," he said softly. His voice carried with unnatural clarity across the plaza, and for reasons they couldn't articulate, every stormtrooper felt their hands begin to shake. The officer recovered first. "Open fire." Blaster bolts lit up the plaza, dozens of shots converging on Jinwoo's position. The civilians screamed and dove for cover. The execution squad poured fire into the alley, their weapons bright with sustained discharge. The shadow simply rose. It moved like liquid, like smoke, like the space between thoughts. It flowed upward and outward, intercepting every blaster bolt before it could reach Jinwoo. And then it kept moving, spreading across the plaza in absolute silence. The stormtroopers didn't even have time to scream. Shadows wrapped around them like gentle hands, pulling them down into darkness that shouldn't exist in the middle of a sunny day. They sank into the stone ground as if it had turned to black water. One moment, 60 armed soldiers. The next, nothing but empty armor clattering to the ground. And then the armor dissolved into shadow too. The officer stumbled backward, his carefully maintained composure shattered. He reached for his calm, trying to call for reinforcements, but his hands wouldn't obey him. Shadow had already claimed his legs, creeping up his body with patient inevitability. "Please," he whispered. I have a family." Jinwoo looked at him without sympathy or cruelty. "You had choices," he said quietly. "They did not." He gestured to the kneeling civilians. The officer sank into shadow and disappeared. Perfect silence fell across the plaza. The bound civilians remained frozen, unsure whether they had been saved or simply encountered a different kind of death. Jinwoo walked past them, and as his shadow touched their bonds, the restraints dissolved like morning frost. "Go," he said without looking back. "There are no Imperials left on this continent." It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. His shadows had already spread through the garrison compound, the command center, the orbital supply depot. 3,000 Imperial personnel had been harvested in less than 30 seconds, added to his army without noise, without spectacle, without the satisfaction of revenge or the messiness of justice, just clean, absolute removal. Jinwoo walked back into shadow and vanished, leaving behind a plaza full of freed civilians who would spend years trying to explain what they had witnessed. Above Corellia, a star destroyer named the Unrelenting prepared to board a suspected rebel transport vessel. The operation was route and intercept, board, interrogate, execute if necessary, appropriate supplies. The Imperial Navy had performed this sequence 10,000 times across the galaxy. The boarding shuttles launched. Stormtroopers checked their weapons. Inquisitors meditated on the dark side, preparing to crush any resistance through force-assisted interrogation. Gojo Satoru appeared directly in the path of the lead boarding shuttle. He stood in the vacuum of space, arms crossed, no spacesuit, no ship, just casually hanging in orbit, as if gravity and life support were suggestions he had chosen to ignore. His white hair drifted around his face, and even through the viewport, the shuttle pilots could see him smiling. The shuttle tried to veer around him. Space bent. The shuttle found itself flying in a perfect circle, looping back toward the Star Destroyer despite the pilot's best efforts. The other boarding craft experienced the same phenomenon, trajectory becoming impossible, their flight paths twisting into recursive knots. "What the hell is?" The pilot's voice cut off as Gojo appeared inside the shuttle. Just appeared. No airlock, no entry. He was simply standing in the passenger bay, surrounded by very confused stormtroopers. "So, quick question," Gojo said cheerfully. "Why's everybody wearing the same outfit? Is this a cosplay thing? Because the aesthetic is very evil Empire, which is either really commit to the bit or extremely on the nose." 20 stormtroopers opened fire simultaneously. Gojo stood there, unbothered, as blaster bolts stopped 3 centimeters from his body and hung suspended in the air like frozen fireflies. He examined one curiously, poking at it. The bolt rotated slowly but couldn't advance. "Plasma-based, interesting, decent velocity, terrible accuracy. Seriously, do these helmets have, like, any targeting assistance? Because your aim is impressively bad." An Inquisitor pushed through the stormtroopers, red lightsaber igniting. "You dare mock the Empire? I mean, kind of?" Gojo shrugged. "You're literally calling yourselves the Empire and wearing all black and using red laser swords. That's villain branding 101. Where I'm from, you'd get copyright struck for being derivative." The Inquisitor lunged, lightsaber aimed at Gojo's throat. The blade stopped, just like the blaster bolts. Infinity didn't care whether the attack was solid, energy, or plasmat, simply ensured that Gojo remained permanently elsewhere. "Okay, time out," Gojo said, raising a hand. Space compressed around the shuttle's interior. Not violently, just repositioned. Every stormtrooper, every Inquisitor, every weapon and piece of equipment suddenly found themselves floating outside the shuttle in vacuum, still alive but very confused. Gojo warped space again, creating breathable air pockets around each person so they wouldn't immediately die, because despite his irreverence, he wasn't casually cruel. "Here's the deal," he called out, his voice somehow carrying through vacuum because Infinity could make sound waves do whatever he wanted. "I'm going to let you float here for a bit to think about your life choices. When a rescue ship picks you up, maybe consider whether boarding random transports to terrorize civilians is really the career path you want." He teleported to the Star Destroyer next. In the bridge, alarms screamed as every system simultaneously failed. Not damaged, just stopped. Gravity turned optional. Consoles phased slightly out of reality. The ship's captain found himself unable to give orders because sound waves refused to travel properly. Gojo appeared in the captain's chair, feet up on the console. "So, who's in charge of naming these things? Unrelenting. That's such a try-hard name. Why not just call it the we're definitely compensating for something?" The Star Destroyer began drifting toward the planet's gravity well, all propulsion offline. By the time Gojo left, every Imperial crew member was unharmed but thoroughly humiliated, their vessel crippled, and their operational doctrine shattered by the realization that someone existed who could mock them with absolute impunity. Across the galaxy, Imperial scanners picked up 2 impossible patterns. 1. A series of garrisons going dark with no distress signals, no evidence, just absence. 2. A being that appeared on instruments as a localized breakdown in physics itself. The rebels whispered of miracles. The Empire felt something it had spent decades making others feel. Fear without explanation. In a hidden sanctuary on Batuu, 7 Jedi survivors gathered in emergency council. They had escaped Order 66 through luck, skill, or Force-granted foresight, and had spent years living in shadows while the Empire hunted their kind to extinction. They were used to uncertainty. They had made peace with fear. But this was different. Master Shan, a human woman whose grey hair still showed traces of the brown it had been before the purge, spoke first. The Force is confused. I have never felt such a thing. It does not know how to categorize what has entered our galaxy. A Togruta Jedi named Kale shook his head. It's more than confusion. The currents of the Force have changed. Futures I could see yesterday are invisible today. And there are 2 voids, not dark side voids, just absence. Places where the Force encounters something it cannot touch. They had been tracking the reports. An Imperial garrison on Ryloth vanished without trace. A Star Destroyer disabled above Corellia by a single individual who ignored vacuum and physics. Worlds where civilians spoke of liberation from shadows. Others where stormtroopers described a man who laughed while reality bent around him. The one with shadows, Shan said carefully. He raises the dead. I've confirmed this through rebel contacts. Entire battalions of soldiers rising to serve him. This should be dark side necromancy, but she trailed off, struggling with the impossibility. There is no corruption, no suffering. The reanimated are not in pain. They simply obey. Another Jedi, younger, more dogmatic, stood abruptly. That is impossible. The dark side requires suffering to function. It is parasitic by nature. You cannot command death without feeding on anguish. And yet, Kale said quietly, he does. In the Sith fortress on Drummond Cars, a different kind of debate raged. Lord Skyer, a human Sith who had carved her path through betrayal and raw power, slammed her fist on the ancient stone table. We should be claiming this asset, a being who commands death without the weakness of emotion. That is pure power. Exactly what the dark side was always meant to be. Her rival, a Zabrak named Vex, sneered. You fool. We tried to probe his shadows. 3 acolytes sent to investigate the Ryloth incident. Do you know what happened? They died? Worse. They were taken, absorbed. I felt their presence vanish from the Force entirely, and then for just a moment I felt them again. Changed, belonging to him. Not corrupted, not twisted, just his. The room went silent. Sith philosophy was built on domination, on bending others to your will through fear and power. But this was something else entirely. This was ownership on a level that bypassed will altogether. And the other one? Skyer asked quietly. Vex's expression darkened. The one they're calling the untouchable. We sent an Inquisitor to test him, a trained Force user with a decade of experience in breaking rebellious minds. And the Inquisitor tried mind tricks, tried to sense his emotions through the Force, found nothing. Then attempted Force lightning. Vex paused. The lightning stopped before it could reach him. Not blocked by a lightsaber, not absorbed, just stopped. As if space itself refused to allow the attack to land. The Inquisitor panicked and tried to retreat. The untouchable smiled, waved, and let him go. Do you understand what that means? Skyer understood. In Sith culture, mercy was more insulting than murder. To be dismissed as harmless, to be waved away like an annoying insect, that was the deepest humiliation possible. On Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine stood alone in his meditation chamber, deep beneath the Imperial Palace. His consciousness stretched across the galaxy, touching the dark side nexus points he had spent decades cultivating. From these anchors he had always been able to perceive the flow of galactic events, to shape futures before they crystallized into present. Now, 2 of those futures simply stopped. He focused on the one called the Shadow Monarch first. Palpatine had mastered dark side necromancy centuries ago, had learned to bind spirits through their suffering, to make death itself a tool of domination. But this being's approach was incomprehensible. No ritual, no sacrifice, no suffering fueling the technique. Just absolute authority that the dead recognized and obeyed. Palpatine tried to peer deeper, to understand the mechanism. His consciousness touched the edge of Jinwoo's shadow realm. and was very gently pushed back, not attacked, not consumed, just denied entry. The way a castle door closes against an uninvited guest. The Shadow Monarch's power didn't fight the Force. It simply existed in a space where the Force had no jurisdiction. Palpatine withdrew, disturbed in a way he hadn't been since his apprenticeship under Darth Plagueis. He turned his attention to the other anomaly, the untouchable. This one was even more frustrating. The Force could perceive him, could feel his presence, but could not interact with him in any meaningful way. Every attempt to influence, read, or predict him collapsed into recursive failure. It was like trying to grab water with a clenched fist, and worse, the untouchable seemed amused by it all. Reports indicated he treated combat like a game, mocked Imperial operations, disabled Star Destroyers as if they were toys. This wasn't the behavior of a revolutionary or a Jedi. This was someone who fundamentally did not take the Empire seriously. Palpatine had built his power on fear and manipulation. You could not fear what you could not touch. You could not manipulate what you could not read. The Emperor opened his eyes, yellow irises glowing in the darkness. For the first time in 50 years, Palpatine felt uncertain. Across the galaxy, the Force itself seemed to hold its breath. The prophecy of the Chosen One, the ancient balance between light and dark, the carefully orchestrated destiny that had guided galactic events for millennia, all of it suddenly felt incomplete. The galaxy had encountered two beings who existed outside prophecy, and prophecy had no response. Jedi debated whether these arrivals were salvation or damnation. The Sith schemed about control they could not achieve. The Emperor calculated scenarios that refused to resolve. And in the space between certainty and chaos, destiny began to collapse. The Imperial War Council convened an emergency session aboard the Superstar Destroyer Executor. Grand Admiral Thrawn stood before the holographic display, his aged face illuminated by tactical projections showing 18 separate incidents across the Outer Rim. Each incident represented an impossibility. "Gentlemen," Thrawn said, his voice clipped with military precision, "we are facing an enemy that should not exist. Standard doctrine has failed. Standard weapons have failed. The Force itself has failed." He gestured to the holographic markers. "We now proceed with absolute overwhelming force." The plan was elegant in its brutality. Simultaneous strikes on known locations of both anomalies, not capture, not study. Elimination through saturation bombardment. If you cannot control something, you erase it. The Empire deployed 17 Star Destroyers, 40 Interdictor-class cruisers, 200 TIE fighter squadrons, and 50 Inquisitors supported by elite stormtrooper legions, equipped with experimental weapons designed to disrupt Force abilities. It was the largest coordinated military operation the Empire had launched since the siege of Mon Cala. Intelligence had tracked the Shadow Monarch to Ord Mantell, specifically to a city world where Imperial occupation had become particularly brutal. Surveillance showed him walking openly through the streets, apparently unconcerned with concealment. The first wave hit at dawn. Orbital bombardment, precise, overwhelming. 50 turbolaser batteries targeting the city district where Jinwoo had been spotted. The sky turned green with plasma fire, each shot capable of vaporizing a city block. The shadows rose to meet them. Imagine darkness given will, given purpose, given the patience of a king who had fought gods and found them wanting. Jinwoo stood in the city center as death fell from above, and his shadow army materialized around him in numbers that defied the statistics of his known engagements. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. They emerged from every shadow in the city, from alleyways, from beneath vehicles, from the darkness inside buildings. Shadow soldiers that Jinwoo had accumulated across 2 galaxies, across countless battles, across every enemy who had ever thought death was an ending rather than a transfer of ownership. The shadows rose like a tidal wave, flowing upward into the sky in a spiral of absolute darkness. They caught the turbolaser fire, absorbed it, dispersed it into nothing. And then they kept rising, flowing up through the atmosphere toward the Star Destroyers themselves. On the bridge of the lead destroyer, alarms screamed. "Sir, we have..." "I don't know what we have. Mass readings are impossible. Scanners show solid matter, but life signs are there everywhere, sir. Tens of thousands of contacts entering the ship through hull breaches we didn't know we had." The captain tried to maintain composure. "Seal all bulkheads. Release countermeasures. Shadows poured through the ship like smoke through a screen door. They materialized in corridors, in crew quarters, in the engine rooms, not attacking, not killing, just appearing silent and unstoppable, and every Imperial crew member they touched simply stopped fighting, stopped resisting, fell into shadow and was claimed. Within 6 minutes, the Star Destroyer went dark. Not destroyed, harvested. The same scene played out across the fleet. 17 Star Destroyers, each carrying thousands of crew members, each becoming a tomb that fed Jinwoo's ever-growing army. The Inquisitors tried to use the Force to repel the shadows, failed. Their dark side powers had nothing to grip, no emotion to exploit. One Inquisitor managed to send a final transmission. It's not an attack, it's collection. He's not fighting us, he's just taking ownership. Then, static. Jinwoo walked through the burning city, his expression unchanged. Shadows flowed around him, protecting civilians, extinguishing fires, removing every trace of Imperial presence with surgical precision. He had not asked to be brought to this galaxy. He had not sought this fight. But if this empire insisted on slaughtering innocents, then he would do what he had always done: claim death's authority and redistribute it according to his judgment. 300 light-years away, Gojo Satoru was having significantly more fun. The Imperial ambush on Kashyyyk had been textbooks around the target, cut off escape routes, deploy overwhelming force. 200 elite stormtroopers, 20 AT-ST walkers, 10 Inquisitors, and air support from 3 Imperial cruisers in low orbit. Gojo stood in the forest clearing, hands in his pockets, watching the encirclement complete itself with genuine interest.
"Wow," he said.
"You guys really committed to this. How long did the planning take? Had to be at least a few days, right? I'm flattered." An Inquisitor stepped forward, attempting to project menace through the Force. "Surrender, and your death will be quick." Gojo tilted his head. "See, that's where you're running into a conceptual problem. Death requires, physical contact. And I've got this thing where nothing actually touches me. Ever. It's kind of my whole deal." The Inquisitor signaled the attack. What happened next would be analyzed by Imperial strategists for months, though they would never fully understand it. Gojo moved, or rather, he stopped moving but appeared in different locations anyway, space rearranging itself so that here and there became negotiable concepts. Blaster fire from 200 soldiers converged on his position and found only empty air. He appeared behind the firing line, yawned, and space compressed. Not violently, not dramatically, just compressed. A sphere of reality 60 meters in diameter folded in on itself just enough that everyone inside found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, weapons tangled, unable to move without bumping into a dozen comrades. "See, the thing about surrounding someone," Gojo said from above. He was floating now. "Because why not? Is that you actually need to be able to hit them. Otherwise you're just standing in a circle. Which is less of a military tactic and more of a team-building exercise." The AT-ST walkers fired. Gojo waved his hand. The blaster cannons inverted their trajectory mid-flight, each shot looping back to strike its own walker in the joints. 20 walkers collapsed simultaneously. Disabled but not destroyed, Gojo had calculated the deflection angles perfectly to cripple without killing pilots. The Inquisitors attacked as a group, coordinated, using dark side techniques designed to overwhelm defenses through synchronized assault. Force lightning, telekinetic crushes, mind attacks, all hitting simultaneously. Infinity didn't care about synchronization. Each attack stopped exactly 3 centimeters from Gojo's body, as predictable as mathematics and equally unmoved by desperation. "Your turn done?" Gojo asked. "Cool, my turn." He raised both hands. Space warped across the entire battlefield, not attacking anyone, not harming anyone, just relocating them. Every stormtrooper, every Inquisitor, every piece of military equipment found themselves suspended 500 meters above the forest canopy, held in place by warped space-time. "Here's the thing," Gojo called up to them, his voice carrying perfectly despite the distance. "I could drop you. Would be super easy. But that seems mean, and honestly, I'm not really invested in this whole Empire versus Rebels thing. So instead," he twisted space again. Every suspended Imperial soldier was teleported to their nearest garrison, unharmed but thoroughly disoriented, their weapons left behind in the forest. The 3 Imperial cruisers in orbit tried to intervene. Gojo appeared on the bridge of the lead ship, startling the captain so badly the man fell out of his chair. "Quick question," Gojo said. "Do you have like a surrender protocol? Because I'm about to disable all your ships, and I'd rather not have anyone panic and blow something important up." Before the captain could answer, Gojo teleported through the entire fleet, appearing in each engine room for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he placed small spatial warps inside key systems, not breaking anything, just making the components exist in slightly different dimensions from each other. Impossible to fix without understanding higher dimensional mathematics. The cruisers went dead in space.
"Thanks for playing,"
Gojo said cheerfully, waving as he teleported back to the planet's surface. By the time the Empire's overwhelming force operation concluded, the results were catastrophic. 17 star destroyers claimed by Shadows, their crews added to an army that now numbered in the millions. 3 Imperial garrison worlds completely pacified without a single civilian casualty. Kashyyyk liberated by one man who treated warfare like an elaborate joke. And on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine stared at the casualty reports and realized something that sent ice through his ancient heart. They weren't winning. They were feeding the enemy with every attack. The Shadow Monarch grew stronger with every soldier sent against him. The untouchable couldn't be touched regardless of force strength. The Empire had just struck at the uncontrollable, and the uncontrollable hadn't even struck back. Yetmish. The ruined moon of Jeddah had become a graveyard twice over. First, when the Death Star's superlaser had torn away half its mass. Second, when the Force itself seemed to abandon what remained, leaving behind a husk of broken temples and shattered faith. It was here, in the dead heart of a place once sacred, that 2 impossibilities finally met. Sung Jin-woo materialized from shadow at the edge of a collapsed plaza, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. A resonance, a presence that didn't register in the Force because it existed orthogonal to that energy entirely. He looked across the ruins and saw him. Gojo Satoru sat on a chunk of broken temple pillar, legs dangling, eating something that looked vaguely like a ration bar he'd liberated from an Imperial supply depot. He looked up as Jinwoo approached, and despite having never met, despite being from different universes entirely, recognition passed between them instantly. They knew what they were looking at. Peers. Not in power could be measured, compared, ranked. This was something else. They were both beings who had transcended the rules of their realities so completely that they no longer fit in the categories those realities used to understand strength. "Huh," Gojo said, standing up and brushing dust off his pants. "So you're the one who's been collecting an army. Gotta say, the aesthetic is very Dark Lord, but I've been checking the news feeds, and you mostly seem to use it to protect people. That's weird, right? Like mixed messaging." Jinwoo studied him for a moment. The darkness of his shadows rippled slightly, a reflexive response to perceived threat, but he kept them in check. "And you're the one who makes a game of war. The Empire has labeled you a terrorist. The rebels call you a miracle. You treat both with equal disrespect." "Terrorist feels harsh. I prefer unsolicited peace consultant." Gojo's grin widened. "But yeah, you got me. I'm not really built for taking things seriously. Where I come from, I was the strongest. And when you're the strongest, everything becomes," he gestured vaguely, "easy, boring. This galaxy's been more interesting at least." "The strongest," Jinwoo repeated quietly. "Not anymore. Now you're one of 2. The words hung in the air between them, not quite a challenge, not quite a statement of fact. Something else. An acknowledgement. Gojo's smile shifted, becoming sharper, more genuine. "You felt it too? That little itch?" "The first time since I perfected infinity that I've encountered someone who might actually know." The word was soft but absolute. Jinwoo's expression hadn't changed, but his shadows had stopped moving entirely, becoming perfectly still in that way that predators go motionless before striking. "If we fight," Jinwoo continued, "this moon becomes dust. Everything within 100 light years becomes collateral damage. And for what? To satisfy curiosity? I've already fought every battle that mattered. I have nothing to prove." Gojo's grin didn't fade, but something shifted in his eyes, interest deepening into actual respect. "So you can recognize the weight of it. Most people can't. They think power is just about winning fights. But you..." He trailed off, then laughed softly. "You're tired, aren't you? Been too strong for too long. Nothing challenges you anymore, so everything feels hollow." Jinwoo said nothing. The silence was answer enough. "Okay," Gojo said. "No destructive testing, but I'm still curious." He raised one hand, and space bent around his fingers, infinity making itself visible through sheer concentration. "Just a light tap, see what happens when our weird powers interact." Scientific inquiry. "Very respectable." Jinwoo considered, then nodded slightly. His shadows responded, flowing from the ground to form a tendril of pure darkness. Not attacking, just reaching. "Curious." The shadow extended toward Gojo's outstretched hand, and stopped. 3 centimeters from his skin, the shadow encountered infinity. It didn't recoil or disperse. It simply existed in the space before the infinite barrier, pressing gently against something that had no physical form but absolute mathematical presence. Gojo's 6 eyes analyzed the shadow's structure, and his eyebrows rose. "Okay, that's fascinating. Your shadows aren't made of cursed energy or anything similar. They're just authority, conceptual ownership given physical form. No wonder the Force can't categorize you." Jinwoo's shadow didn't retreat. It shifted, flowed, tested the boundaries of infinity from different angles, and discovered the same thing from every direction, an insurmountable wall of space that refused to allow contact. "You exist in a space that denies interaction," Jinwoo observed. "Nothing can touch you because you've made distance to Gojo Satoru an infinite value." "Pretty much, yeah. Autofilters everything attacks, air quality, bad vibes." Gojo tilted his head. "But your shadows aren't trying to force through, they're just there, like they're waiting for me to give permission. That's not how attacks work, because they're not attacks. They're extensions of my will, and my will recognizes that you cannot be commanded." Jinwoo's shadow withdrew, flowing back into the ground. "Your power isn't strength, it's absolute autonomy. You exist outside causality itself. And yours isn't necromancy, it's dominion. You don't control death, you are its legitimate authority." Gojo lowered his hand, infinity relaxing. "We're both broken, just in different directions. I can't be touched. You can't be denied. What happens when unstoppable meets unreachable?" "Nothing," Jinwoo said. "We acknowledge each other and move on." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 beings who had spent so long being stronger than everyone else that they'd forgotten what it felt like to meet an equal. Not in power, equality in power was meaningless at their level, but in weight. In the exhausting, isolating burden of being beyond comparison. "So what are you going to do?" Gojo asked finally. "The Empire's terrified of you, the rebels want to recruit you. Everyone's trying to fit you into their story. What I've always done, protect those who cannot protect themselves, end threats that need ending. The rest is irrelevant." Jinwoo turned to leave, shadows already gathering to transport him. "And you?" Gojo shrugged. "Probably keep messing with the Empire until someone interesting shows up. Maybe find a way home. Haven't decided yet." He paused. "Hey, if you ever get bored of the whole solitary King of Death thing, let me know. Could be fun to actually work with someone who gets it." Jinwoo glanced back, the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement crossing his face. "I work alone." "Yeah," Gojo said, smiling. "Me too." They parted ways on the dead moon of Gedda, 2 legends who had briefly touched the edge of what might have been camaraderie, then retreated back into the isolation that power demanded. The galaxy watched their meeting through long-range Imperial surveillance, and realized with growing dread that if these 2 ever decided to cooperate, there would be no force in existence capable of stopping them. But cooperation would require caring about galactic politics, and neither of them cared at all. The Emperor's decision was transmitted across every Imperial channel with priority alpha encryption, total annihilation protocol. The designation was reserved for planetary-scale extinction events, rebellions so deeply rooted that the only solution was to burn the world and start over. But this wasn't about rebellion. This was about fear. Palpatine had spent decades perfecting the Imperial doctrine, control through overwhelming force, through the certainty that resistance meant not just death, but the death of everything you loved. It was a system built on predictability. The Empire's brutality was a known quantity, which made it a tool for compliance. These 2 anomalies had shattered that predictability. You could not threaten someone you could not touch. You could not terrorize someone who treated your terror apparatus like an inconvenience. And worst of all, you could not maintain an empire on fear when your subjects watched gods humiliate your forces and then walk away laughing. The new protocol was simple, identify civilian populations allied with or sheltering either anomaly, target them. Force the anomalies to choose between their apparent moral principles and their obvious disinterest in galactic politics. Make them care by making innocents suffer. It was a strategy Palpatine had used successfully for 50 years. It had never failed. The first target was Lothal, a world where rebel sympathies ran deep and where witnesses claimed to have seen the Shadow Monarch eliminating Imperial patrols. Grand Admiral Constantine received his orders directly from Coruscant. Orbital bombardment of the capital city. 7 million civilians. Acceptable losses in exchange for drawing out a target that conventional forces could not engage. The Star Destroyers moved into position. Turbolasers charged. Targeting solutions locked. On the surface, rebel cells scrambled to evacuate who they could, knowing it was futile. 7 million people. 3 hours until bombardment. Not enough ships. Not enough time. The mathematics of extinction were brutally simple. And then the sky turned black. Not metaphorically. The actual sky above Lothal's capital darkened as if a curtain had been drawn across the sun. Shadows fell from orbit or rose from the planet, the direction unclear, forming a barrier of absolute darkness between the Star Destroyers and the city below. Sung Jin-woo stood in the city square, one hand raised, his expression colder than vacuum. The first turbolaser volley fired. 50 shots, each capable of vaporizing a city block. They struck the shadow barrier and simply stopped, their energy absorbed and dispersed into nothingness. The second volley followed. Same result. The third, fourth, fifth, the fleet poured fire into the barrier for 20 minutes straight, enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. The shadows didn't even ripple. Jinwoo's voice carried across the calm channels, bypassing encryption through sheer force of will translated into shadow. Every officer, every stormtrooper, every crew member in the fleet heard him speak directly into their minds, not invasive, not painful, just present, the way a king's proclamation reaches every subject simultaneously. You were given chances, he said quietly. Opportunities to stop, to leave, to be better than your brutality. His shadows began to rise, flowing up from the planet toward the fleet. You chose this. Return to your homes, tell your emperor, if innocents burn, his empire burns with them. The fleet retreated in disarray, not because they were defeated in combat, but because every admiral suddenly understood with crystalline certainty that continued bombardment meant their entire crews would be harvested. Added to an army that already numbered in the millions, they would become weapons turned against the very empire they served. Terror doctrine requires your victims to believe surrender is an option. The Shadow Monarch offered no surrender, only ownership. The Star Destroyers jumped to hyperspace, fleeing from a single man who had threatened to claim an entire regime. On Lothal's surface, Jinwoo lowered his hand. The shadows withdrew. 7 million civilians lived, most never even knowing how close they'd come to annihilation. But Jinwoo knew. And something shifted in his expression, subtle, dangerous. He had come to this galaxy with no interest in its politics, no stake in its wars. He had intervened against imperial cruelty because his nature demanded he protect the helpless, but he had done so without anger. Now, for the first time since arriving, Sung Jin-woo was angry. The Empire had tried to make him care through hostage tactics. They had succeeded, and they would learn to regret it. Halfway across the galaxy, Gojo Satoru received the same message every rebel cell, every underground network, every pocket of resistance heard simultaneously. The Empire was escalating to civilian targets, not as collateral damage, as primary objectives. Gojo stood on a rebel frigate, listening to the transmission detailing the Lothal incident and the 27 other worlds now designated for AI pacification through example. His usual smile had vanished entirely, replaced by something the rebels had never seen on his face before. Cold, focused rage. They're using civilians as bait, a rebel commander said, her voice shaking. We can't defend 27 worlds. We don't have the ships, the weapons, You don't need to defend them, Gojo interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the briefing room fall silent. I'll handle it. One person can't, I'm not a person. Gojo turned, and his eyes, usually hidden behind a blindfold or closed in perpetual amusement, opened fully. The 6 eyes glowed with barely contained power. I'm the strongest, and I've been playing nice because this wasn't my fight. But if this empire wants to murder children to get my attention... He smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. They've got it. What followed over the next 72 hours would be recorded in Imperial records as the systematic dismantling. Gojo Satoru appeared on each of the 27 targeted worlds, not fighting, not destroying, just removing Imperial presence. He teleported entire garrison forces into desert wastelands, unharmed but stranded. He warped the space around Imperial governors' palaces, creating pocket dimensions where time moved differently. 3 years passed inside for every minute outside. Governors emerged aged and broken, their will to oppress thoroughly shattered. He dismantled star destroyers by making their components exist in slightly different dimensional frequencies, not destroyed, just disassembled on a molecular level and scattered across safe orbits. Every action was precise, surgical, and absolutely humiliating. By the time he finished, 27 worlds were free. Not a single civilian had died, and the Empire had lost 16,000 troops and 43 capital ships without Gojo killing a single person. The message was clear: you cannot threaten innocents to control me. I don't care about your politics, but if you target civilians, I will dismantle you piece by piece, and you will survive long enough to regret it. On Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine watched reports flood in and realized something that should have been impossible. He was losing. Not militarily, not strategically, but psychologically. The Empire's greatest weapon had always been the certainty of its victory. That certainty was dying. The rebels spoke of miracles now, not desperate hope. Worlds that would have surrendered to Imperial occupation now resisted, betting that gods would intervene. And worst of all, those gods didn't care about power or thrones or galactic control. They cared about innocence, which made them impossible to negotiate with, impossible to corrupt, impossible to stop through any doctrine the Empire understood. Palpatine sat alone in his meditation chamber, feeling something he had not felt since before his rise to power: genuine uncertainty about the future. The galaxy feared gods who wanted nothing. The convergence point was Mustafar, the lava planet where Sith Lord Vader had been born from Anakin Skywalker's ashes, where the dark side ran deep enough to warp reality itself. The Empire chose it deliberately, a location where dark side energy could be weaponized, where the Emperor himself could join the battle through Sith sorcery, where the full might of Imperial doctrine could finally, definitively eliminate the threats. 12 star destroyers in orbit, 50,000 elite stormtroopers on the ground, every Inquisitor the Empire possessed, ancient Sith artifacts activated to amplify dark side powers. And in the fortress at the planet's molten heart, Emperor Palpatine himself, channeling decades of accumulated power into a ritual designed to bind both anomalies to his will. If brute force couldn't defeat them, then the Force itself twisted through the dark side would enslave them. The Imperial commanders positioned their forces with precision. A killing field around the fortress, overlapping fields of fire, no escape routes. They had learned from previous failures. This time, overwhelming power would be applied continuously from every angle until even the impossible broke. Sung Jin-woo arrived first, stepping out of shadow onto the volcanic plains. He looked at the assembled forces, the star destroyers above, the endless ranks of soldiers, the fortress where dark side energy pulsed like a diseased hearthand. His expression didn't change. "Leave," he said simply. His voice carried across the comms without technological assistance. "This is your final warning." The response was unified bombardment. Every weapon fired simultaneously. The sky turned bright with plasma fire. Jinwoo released his full authority. The Shadow Army materialized, not in hundreds or thousands, but in millions. Every soldier he had claimed across 2 galaxies, every warrior who had fallen before his power and been granted purpose beyond death, they emerged from shadows that shouldn't exist on a planet with binary suns, flowing across the volcanic landscape like a dark tide. The Imperial forces opened fire. Blaster bolts by the tens of thousands, turbolaser strikes from orbit, missiles and thermal detonators, and every weapon of war the galaxy had perfected over millennia. The shadows absorbed it all and kept advancing. They moved with perfect coordination, not mindless but thoughtful, each soldier executing maneuvers with the skill they'd possessed in life, enhanced by absolute unity of purpose. They didn't kill when they reached Imperial lines, they simply claimed, touched, harvested. Every stormtrooper they reached joined their ranks, converting the Empire's forces into Jinwoo's army with mathematical inevitability. In the fortress, Palpatine felt his carefully constructed ritual begin to falter. He had designed it to bind beings of power, to turn their strength into chains. But the Shadow Monarch wasn't powered by emotion or drawn from the Force. His authority was conceptual, definitional. You could not bind death itself. The Emperor poured more power into the ritual, drawing on dark side nexus points across the galaxy. The air above Mustafar turned crimson with Sith lightning. Ancient spirits bound to the planet's core rose, shrieking with malevolent hunger. Jinwoo walked through them like they were mist. His shadows consumed the Sith spirits effortlessly, adding ancient darksiders to his army without ceremony or struggle. Beings who had clung to existence through hatred and will for thousands of years simply... The dark side recoiled. 10 minutes into the battle, Gojo Satoru appeared in low orbit, floating above the lead star destroyer. He looked down at the battle shadow's overwhelming military formations, dark side lightning crackling uselessly against an army that felt no fear inside. "Guess we're doing this," he muttered. He raised both hands. Space warped on a planetary scale. Every star destroyer in orbit suddenly found itself existing in a different dimensional frequency. Not destroyed, not damaged, just elsewhere. Phased into a parallel space where they could observe but not interact. Their weapons fired through their targets without connecting. Their crews remained unharmed but completely ineffective. "Time out for you guys," Gojo said cheerfully.
Watch and learn.
He teleported to the fortress, appearing directly in Palpatine's ritual chamber. The Emperor spun, yellow eyes blazing, dark side power coalescing into a storm of destruction. "You dare? Yeah, I dare." Gojo yawned. "Look, I'm going to level with you. This whole Empire thing. The torture, the genocide, the really aggressive workplace culture. Not a fan. And honestly, I've been pretty hands-off because toppling governments isn't really my scene. But then you started targeting kids to get at me and my new shadow-themed acquaintance. And that was just..." He snapped his fingers. The space around Palpatine compressed, not harming him but completely immobilizing him. The Emperor's dark side storm stopped mid-manifestation, frozen in place. "Tacky," Gojo finished.
Super tacky.
Outside, Jinwoo reached the fortress entrance. His shadow army had already claimed 90% of the ground forces, converting Imperial military might into his own strength with relentless efficiency. He paused as he felt Gojo's power spike inside the fortress, then continued forward. They met in the central chamber, standing on opposite sides of the frozen Emperor. Jinwoo's shadows flowed around the room like living darkness. Gojo's infinity made space itself uncertain.
"So,"
Gojo said conversationally, "what do we do with this one? He's kind of the linchpin of the whole evil empire thing." Jinwoo studied Palpatine frozen, furious, still radiating dark side power that had nowhere to go. Killing him creates a power vacuum. The empire fractures into warlords, more suffering. But leaving him alive means the empire continues. No. Jinwoo's shadows extended toward the frozen emperor, not attacking, just measuring. "We remove his power. Every Sith artifact, every dark side nexus he's bound himself to, every source of his authority." His gaze shifted to Gojo. "And then we let him live as what he truly is without power. Human, mortal, irrelevant." Gojo's grin widened. "Oh, that's mean. I like it." What followed was not a battle but a systematic dismantling. Gojo warped space across Coruscant, relocating every Imperial superweapon, every doomsday device, every tool of mass oppression into a pocket dimension where they could never be accessed. Jinwoo's shadows spread through the dark side nexus points across the galaxy, severing Palpatine's connections one by one, consuming the anchors that had kept him alive far beyond natural lifespan. The Emperor aged in seconds, decades of artificial preservation stripped away as his power sources vanished. His yellow eyes faded to old, tired grey. His screams of rage weakened into rasping gasps. Gojo released the spatial compression. Palpatine collapsed, suddenly just an ancient, powerless man. "The Empire is over," Jinwoo said quietly. "Not destroyed, transformed. Your command structure remains intact, but your tools of terror are gone. What rises from this is your species' choice." He turned and walked away, his shadow army dissolving as he released his hold on Mustafar. The claimed Imperial forces woke up disoriented but alive, their weapons gone, their purpose shattered. Gojo lingered for a moment, looking down at the fallen Emperor. "You know what the worst part is? You were never that special. Just a guy with power and no restraint, Where I come from, we eat guys like you for breakfast. He teleported away, leaving Palpatine alone in the ruins of his fortress, powerless and forgotten. Above Mustafar, the dark side went quiet. Not defeated, not destroyed, just silent, waiting to see what would grow in the absence of its greatest predator. The battle was over. The Empire had not been destroyed, but its certainty had been. And across the galaxy, beings who had lived in fear for decades felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope. 3 months after Mustafar, the galaxy existed in a state of transformation that historians would spend centuries trying to properly categorize. The Empire had not fallen. Its infrastructure, its bureaucracy, its thousand-world government remained largely intact, but the instruments of terror were gone. The Death Star plans destroyed. The Inquisitors disbanded after their defeat. The Superstar Destroyers, relocated to a pocket dimension by Gojo and used as negotiating leverage for Imperial cooperation with newly independent systems. What emerged was messy, complicated, and profoundly uncertain. Some Imperial governors continued their brutality through conventional means and found themselves facing populations emboldened by the knowledge that miracles were real. Other systems negotiated peaceful transition. A few descended into chaos that neither Jinwoo nor Gojo intervened to stop. They were liberators, not rulers, and freedom meant accepting the consequences of choice. The Jedi survivors came out of hiding slowly, cautiously, unsure whether their ancient order had any place in a galaxy where prophecy had been shattered. The Force itself seemed different now, less certain, more open to interpretation. Some Jedi saw this as corruption. Others saw it as evolution. Sung Jin-woo stood at the edge of the unknown regions, in a system so remote that Imperial charts listed it as uninhabited. His shadow army spread through the darkness of uncharted space, silently eliminating the threats that lurked beyond the galaxy's borders. Ancient evils, predatory hive species, things that had been waiting for galactic civilization to weaken enough to harvest. He had no interest in being worshipped, no desire to rule. The galaxy whispered his name as savior, as destroyer, as the Shadow King. He ignored all of it. What he did care about was simple: keeping death contained where it belonged. The unknown regions were full of things that wanted to bring extinction to the galaxy. So he claimed that darkness first, made it his, and used it to guard the borders no one else could defend. A rebel delegation found him once, traveling deep into uncharted space to offer gratitude, to ask if he would join their new government as protector or advisor. Jinwoo listened politely, then declined. "I am not a symbol. I am not a weapon you can aim. I do what must be done, and I do it alone. If your systems need a protector to survive, then you have not truly freed yourselves." He left them in the unknown regions and did not return to the civilized galaxy. But his shadows remained, invisible watchers on the border worlds, silent guardians against the darkness beyond. Gojo Satoru characteristically took a different approach. He wandered, appeared on random worlds, helped rebel cells overthrow lingering Imperial holdouts, taught Force-sensitive children that power didn't have to corrupt, challenged remaining Inquisitors to fights that always ended in humiliation rather than death. He was spotted on Tatooine, buying drinks for Mos Eisley Cantina patrons and laughing at their stories. On Naboo, stopping a coup attempt by simply teleporting the would-be dictator to a peaceful farming community and leaving him there with no weapons and a note saying, "Try farming, it builds character." On Corellia, racing modified speeders just to see if anything in this galaxy could provide a challenge. He never stayed long, never built anything permanent, never let anyone get too close. Because despite his irreverence, despite the smiles and jokes, Gojo understood the same truth Jinwoo had learned long ago. When you're the strongest, everyone around you becomes either a responsibility or a target. Friendship meant vulnerability. Connection meant weakness. So he kept moving, kept laughing, kept helping in ways that required no commitment. A Jedi Master found him once, meditating on the Force and trying to understand how infinity functioned. The conversation lasted 3 hours and ended with the Jedi having an existential crisis about the nature of reality, while Gojo patted his shoulder sympathetically. "The Force is great and all," Gojo said, "but maybe don't let it do all your thinking for you. Sometimes things just happen outside destiny, you know?" Eventually, after 6 months of wandering, Gojo stood on a cliffside on Naboo and felt it. A tug. Faint. Familiar. The same resonance that had pulled him to this galaxy in the first place, now pulling in reverse. His universe was calling him home. He stood there for a long time, watching the sunset, considering. This galaxy had been interesting. More interesting than his own world in some ways, but it wasn't his. These weren't his problems to solve, and honestly, he was getting bored again. Time to go, he said to no one in particular. He teleported one final time, appearing in the ruins of Jeddah, where he'd first met Jinwoo. Left a message carved into stone using spatial distortion. Had fun. Try not to blow yourselves up. GS. Then he walked into the dimensional rift that opened before him and vanished, returning to a universe where curses waited and students needed teaching, and he could be properly, magnificently bored again. Jinwoo felt Gojo's departure through the shadow network, acknowledged it, felt the faintest trace of something that might have been regret for a moment. He'd encountered someone who understood the weight of transcendent power. Then the moment passed. He returned to his work, guarding the dark. The galaxy moved on, forever changed by two beings who had broken destiny, liberated millions, and then departed without asking for gratitude or worship. Legends were told. Stories were passed down. Religions formed around the Shadow King and the untouchable god. But the subjects of those legends were already gone, returned to their isolation, their power too vast to share, their existence too strange to explain. The Star Wars galaxy had encountered the impossible, and the impossible had decided the galaxy was worth saving but not worth staying for. In the end, that might have been the greatest mercy of all.